So the question then is, how does technological improvement relate to the unemployment rate in the long run? And what we're going to see is that while there may be a short run adjustment to increase unemployment, in the long run, it's quite possible that an increase in technology will actually reduce the unemployment rate. And frankly, that's kind of what we've seen. We've either seen a reduction in the unemployment rate or basically no change in the unemployment rate so far to technological improvement. Now, that doesn't mean that we couldn't introduce some technology that would increase unemployment. It just means that so far it hasn't happened. One thing that we do want to think about is that the adjustment doesn't take place instantaneously, and so we don't move automatically to the new lower unemployment rate. And so we want to see how that process happens. And so we want to think about, the lag between the change in the labor market and the movement to the new equilibrium, and how fast it gets sort of diffused through the whole economy, right? So in the United States, we want to make sure that it's not just the coasts that are doing well, but it's the whole country that's doing well because of new technology. So let's think about how this might happen, right? So we have our wage curve, we have our profit curve. Output per worker is on the dashed line. And so if new technology, right, the definition of new technology is that that output per worker is going to increase, it's going to shift up, and that should shift up the real wage as well, right? And so the now we have a higher output per worker and potentially a higher real wage per worker and a lower unemployment rate, right? And so in this case, we move from a 6% unemployment rate to a 4% unemployment rate. Now, why is that? Well, it's because now workers are more productive, and so we want to put more of them to work, right? We move up the wage curve. Now, if this were always true and it happened instantaneously, then people wouldn't be concerned about new technology. They would welcome new technology, right? But over the last 200 years, what we've seen is that people do get concerned about the introduction of new technology. They do worry about job destruction, and they worry that those jobs are not going to come back. And so I think if we think about this process moving from A to B in a little bit more detail, we can see why their concerns may be valid. So let's think about sort of what happens when we get this shift up in output per worker to this higher dotted line and this new real wage per worker. Well, we're introducing a whole new technology, right? And so if that's the case, then the old technology is going to experience a lot of job destruction. And if there's job destruction, then we may move from, say, point A to point D. And that leads to an increase in the unemployment rate. And that means that a lot of people who had been working in this industry no longer have jobs. It means their skills may no longer be relevant. It means they may need to be retrained if they're young, or if they're older, it may mean that they never get a job as good as they had at point A. And that can cause a lot of stress, that can cause a lot of anxiety, and doesn't feel like an improvement to most people who are in that old industry. But then, as profits grow and firms enter, we move to point E, where now we have an even lower unemployment rate. And that will move us up the wage curve, right? And we end up eventually at point B, where the long run rate of unemployment is 4%. When do we get to the long run? Well, I mean, that can be anybody's guess, right? It could be that it happens in 5 years, it could be 10 years, it could be 15 years, it could be 20 years. And 20 years, while not necessarily a super long time, is in one person's work experience a very long time, right? If we think most people work for 40 to 50 years, that could be up to 50% of their work experience. And so if you spend 20 years working in an industry at point A that gets destroyed, you may never experience the labor industry at point B. And so one of the things we want to think about then is what's the best way to make sure that most people benefit when we introduce this new technology. So one way to think about this in terms of the costs that come with new technology is to sort of think about the average wage, right? And the average wage includes the people who are unemployed and therefore are not making any wage, any market wage. And so if we start here, we have some level of employment and some wage rate. And then because of the increase in unemployment, right, that we moved from point A to point D, now we have a lower level of employment, still at that lower wage, and so the total wages are lower. Now it looks like this new technology is destroying jobs, decreasing income, and frankly, it looks like a bad idea. And then eventually we get to this higher level of employment and this higher wage, and everybody says, of course, oh yes, now this was obviously a good idea, and it was clear we always should have done it. But there is a cost, right? And there is a cost between, when the new technology is introduced here at what we're calling date one, and when we reach the new long run equilibrium, what we're calling date two. And so if we experience this lower employment level at D, we are losing some income, and it's going to take us some time to get that income back. And of course, for some individuals, depending on how long the time is between date one and date two, they may not experience that as a good thing, right? If you have been working making carriages your whole life and then this new thing called the automobile gets introduced, that's not going to be a good feeling for you. So the way we can think about it is that how are we going to shift the wage curve, right? Are we going to shift up the wage curve so that workers get more of the income, or are we going to move so that workers get the same amount of income, but we stay on the old wage curve at a lower unemployment rate? And so these are some of the things that we want to think about in the long run when we're thinking about how technology is related both to wages, right? Is that new technology going to increase wages, or is it going to increase the unemployment rate?